Have you ever wondered if true happiness can be found in the company of others, or if it's possible to discover it within yourself, especially as you get older? What if the secret to living a peaceful, fulfilling life isn't about staying in a marriage that no longer brings joy or relying on family or friends, but about embracing your freedom, self-discovery, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living independently? In this video, you'll follow the transformative journey of Emily, a woman who came to understand that happiness doesn't always lie in staying in an unfulfilling relationship or leaning on others for support. As she navigates the heartache of separation, she discovers the liberating power of solitude, the joy of living life on her terms, and the deep peace that comes from being true to herself. Emily's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes, stepping away from a relationship or freeing yourself from the weight of family expectations can lead to a profound sense of contentment and self-worth. By the end of this video, you'll learn how Emily found strength and serenity in the most unexpected places. This isn't just her story. It's a powerful message that, as we age, the most important thing is learning to live for ourselves, making choices that nurture our souls, and embracing the freedom to live life authentically. You won't want to miss the priceless lessons Emily shares about finding true happiness in your later years. If you haven't subscribed yet, I highly encourage you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any new videos. Your support means so much to me, and if you enjoyed this story, you can help me keep sharing these valuable lessons by liking and sharing this video. Each evening, Emily would brew a pot of tea and take it to her balcony, where she could watch the people passing by. Her apartment was situated on a bustling street with constant traffic and pedestrians. She enjoyed watching young families strolling by, laughing together as children played in the yards. Occasionally, her gaze would meet that of couples walking hand in hand, enjoying each other's company. These everyday scenes, though heartwarming, always left her with a mixture of emotions, joy, but also a twinge of sorrow. Perhaps anyone who has spent their later years living alone truly understands the complex feelings such moments stir. Emily was not lacking in material comforts. In her younger years, she and her late husband had worked hard to build a modest home. After her husband's passing, Emily continued to run the small business they had started, managing just enough to build modest savings for her retirement. Many considered her fortunate. She had a roof over her head, a healthy savings account, and children who were successful in their careers. These were the things that many older Americans could only dream of. Yet, for Emily, it wasn't money she felt she was missing, but someone to share her life with. Her peers were surrounded by grandchildren, visiting often, their homes filled with the chatter and laughter of family. Others still had their life partners by their sides, sharing quiet mornings with tea, discussing the events of the day, and exchanging stories of their lives. At gatherings with friends, Emily always appeared cheerful, smiling, and laughing along with everyone else. She would engage in conversation, reminiscing, and make sure everyone was enjoying themselves. But when she returned home, that smile would slowly fade as she was greeted by the silent emptiness of her apartment. It was an early winter afternoon, the sky a dull gray, with a cold wind drifting through the cracks in the windows. Emily felt the chill as it seeped into her bones. She stood by the window, gazing down at the bustling street, just as she always did. Despite the rush of activity below, she felt incredibly small, like a speck of dust drifting aimlessly in the vastness of the world. At that moment, the phone rang, startling her and pulling her back to the present. It was a call from an old friend. "Hey Emily, are you free tomorrow afternoon?" her friend asked. "We're having a reunion at Linda's house. Some old friends are getting together. It's been ages since we last saw each other. Let's catch up." Initially, Emily considered declining the invitation, as she usually did whenever anyone invited her out. She had become accustomed to her quiet life, the comfort of her own space. But for some reason, this time, something within her shifted. She felt a longing to connect, to meet someone, and perhaps ease the loneliness that had been creeping into her heart. After a moment of hesitation, Emily sighed softly and replied, "Yes, I'll come." The next morning, Emily selected a soft blue dress from her closet. The gentle color reflected her graceful years, and the fabric draped elegantly over her figure. She stood in front of the mirror, running her fingers through her hair, which had begun to show streaks of gray. She observed herself for a moment, reminding herself that despite the changes in her appearance, she still carried with her a sense of youthful elegance. The reunion took place in a small, cozy home nestled in a quiet neighborhood. The atmosphere was warm and filled with the sound of laughter. Longtime friends, who hadn't seen each other in years, had all changed in their ways, but their bond remained as strong as ever. Emily sat among them, listening intently as everyone discussed their families and children, occasionally laughing at the funny memories of their youth. She felt a sense of comfort in the familiarity of their voices and the shared history they all had. In a quiet corner of the room, Emily's gaze was drawn to a man whose hair had turned almost entirely gray, but who still carried himself with remarkable style. He sat alone, his cup of tea untouched, a calm and distant air about him, as if he were aware of being watched. He turned to look at her, offering a subtle smile, one that seemed to carry with it the warmth of a soft breeze on a chilly winter's day. "Hello, do you remember me?" he asked in a deep, warm voice that seemed to echo with an unexpected familiarity. Emily frowned slightly, squinting as she studied him. After a moment, recognition dawned, and she said softly, "George? George Miller. We studied together back in college, didn't we? You were one of the top students in our class. I can hardly believe it's been over 30 years. I never expected to run into you here today." Their conversation began with small talk, but it soon deepened, their words flowing more freely, revealing common threads that neither had expected. Emily learned that George had become a successful businessman, but after the passing of his wife more than a decade ago, he had lived alone. His life was filled with accomplishments, but his eyes, so kind and understanding, told a different story. There was a connection between them, an unspoken understanding that two people who had both lived through loss could find in one another. It was as if, after so many years, two lonely souls had found each other again, amid a crowded room. As the reunion wound down and guests began to leave, George approached Emily once more. "I'm so glad we crossed paths again," he said, his voice gentle. "Would you like to meet up again soon, just the two of us? I think we've both missed having a true friend all these years." His words struck Emily like a revelation. She didn't respond immediately, but as she walked out of the house, her mind buzzed with new thoughts, like a stone dropping into a still pond, sending ripples across her heart. That evening, as she sat by her window, looking down at the quiet street below, she thought about George. At 62, she had long believed her heart had closed to the possibility of new connections. But now, after that encounter, it seemed to have cracked open just a little, allowing in a fresh, unexpected breeze. Emily didn't know where this new chapter would take her, but she felt a sense of curiosity. Perhaps, just maybe, there was still room for something new in her life. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Since that reunion, a subtle shift had occurred within her. The image of George's smile and the warmth in his eyes lingered in her mind, like the soft breeze he had metaphorically blown into her life. Sometimes, Emily would chuckle to herself, almost embarrassed by how her heart seemed to be affected by something so trivial, especially at her age. But she had learned long ago that the heart doesn't always follow logic. The next morning, as Emily was tending to her flower pots on the balcony, she was startled when the phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID, not recognizing the number. With a soft sigh, she picked up the receiver. "Hello, this is Emily Miller speaking," she answered. On the other end, the same deep, familiar voice spoke with a calm warmth. "Hi, Emily. This is George Miller. We met again at the reunion yesterday. Do you remember me?" Emily's heart skipped a beat at the sound of his voice. It was almost as if he had walked back into her life again, like a familiar melody she hadn't realized she missed. "Yes, of course, George," she replied, a little breathlessly. "What's up?" George chuckled lightly. His voice was as smooth and unassuming as it had been the day before. "I know this is a bit sudden, but would you like to meet for coffee sometime? I think it's been far too long since we've caught up, and I'd love to have a proper conversation if you're free." Emily hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. It had been many years since anyone had invited her out for coffee like this, especially with such a simple yet sincere invitation. Part of her was unsure, hesitant to let anyone into her quiet routine, but another part of her felt a flicker of excitement, a pull toward something new. Slowly, she replied, her voice a little shaky with nerves. "Yes, okay, I'm free. Let's meet." The afternoon was set for their first meeting, and Emily found herself picking out her outfit with more care than usual. She chose a simple yet elegant dress, one that made her feel comfortable but still put together. When she gazed at herself in the mirror, adjusting her hair, she reminded herself that she still had something to offer, a sense of grace, a quiet elegance, and a life filled with stories. She smiled gently, accepting that perhaps this moment wasn't so trivial after all. On the day of their meeting, Emily selected a simple yet elegant outfit, something that would make her feel both comfortable and presentable. She stood in front of the mirror, gently smoothing her gray hair, neatly tied up in a soft bun. She took a deep breath and sighed to herself, "It's just meeting an old friend, nothing to get nervous about." But even as she reassured herself, her heart was still pounding a little faster than usual. The cafe where George had arranged to meet was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't luxurious or fancy, but it had a charming, nostalgic feel to it. The walls were decorated with framed landscape paintings, the kind you'd expect to find in a cozy countryside home. A vintage clock hung prominently in the center of the room, its ticking sound steady and deliberate, making time feel almost suspended as if the world outside didn't exist. When Emily arrived at the cafe, George was already seated at a small table by the window. He looked the same as she remembered. His hair was now mostly gray, but neatly kept, and his kind eyes, hidden behind glasses, radiated a warmth she hadn't realized she missed. His smile, though gentle, seemed to carry with it a sense of familiarity and comfort. As he stood up to greet her, he said with a light chuckle, "I'm glad you made it. I wasn't sure if you would come." Emily smiled, feeling the tension in her chest start to loosen. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied, sitting down across from him. George ordered 2 cups of chrysanthemum tea, explaining that it was perfect for afternoons like this. Light, soothing, and calming. Their conversation began casually, with small talk about old times, exchanging stories from their college days. As they spoke, George shared more about his life after graduation. How he had worked hard to build his career, started a family, and navigated all the ups and downs that life had thrown his way. He mentioned that his wife had passed away over 10 years ago, unexpectedly, after a sudden illness. George admitted that, at first, he felt like his world had fallen apart. Yet, he had learned to adapt, to live alone, though loneliness had never quite left him. Emily listened quietly, her heart moved by his words. She realized that George, like her, had faced the pain of loss, and though he had found a way to keep going, he too had experienced that quiet, lingering sadness as he grew older. As George spoke, there were pauses, moments when his voice seemed to falter, as though he were reflecting on something too deep for words. The soft music playing in the background shifted to an old folk tune, adding to the melancholy atmosphere. Looking at Emily, George's voice slowed and softened. "Emily, have you ever thought that at our age, we could still find someone to share our lives with? Someone to talk to confide in?" Emily was caught off guard by his question. She looked into his eyes for a moment, surprised by the tenderness in his voice. She smiled, but it was a smile tinged with sadness, a smile that couldn't quite hide the emotions swirling inside her. "I'm not sure," she replied quietly. "I guess I'm just used to living alone now." George didn't say anything else right away, but his eyes spoke volumes. He simply looked at her with understanding, as though he could see right through the walls she had built around herself. After a moment, he said softly, "Sometimes, people get used to living alone not because they enjoy it, but because they're afraid of opening themselves up again. Afraid of having to face another loss." George's words struck Emily deeply, more than she expected. She had spent so many years building walls around her heart, afraid of feeling vulnerable, afraid of experiencing the hurt that came from love and loss. George's understanding seemed to pierce right through the defenses she had put in place, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her fears. The conversation continued, but Emily couldn't help thinking about George's words. She had closed herself off for so long, telling herself that she didn't need anyone, that she was fine on her own. But perhaps, deep down, she knew the truth. Living in solitude wasn't always by choice. Sometimes, it was just easier to remain alone than to risk the pain of losing someone again. Their conversation came to a close as the sky turned a deep shade of purple, the evening settling in around them. George stood up and gently said, "I'm really happy we got to meet today. I hope we can do it again sometime." Emily smiled softly but didn't respond verbally, nodding in acknowledgement as she rose to leave. After all, words often fail to capture the emotions one feels in moments like these. When she arrived home and settled into her quiet apartment, she was surprised to find her heart racing, as though she were a young woman once more. Could it be that after so many years, the simple presence of George had stirred something within her, awakening feelings she thought long forgotten? Since that first meeting at the cafe, Emily and George were subtly tethered together by an invisible thread. In the beginning, they only spoke over the phone. George's calls often came in the late afternoon, just as the light was beginning to dim and the soft glow of evening took over Emily's apartment. His voice over the phone was as deep, warm, and gentle as it had been in person. "How are you today, Emily? Have the flowers in your garden bloomed yet?" he would ask. That simple question, with its genuine interest in the small, seemingly insignificant details of her life, warmed Emily's heart in a way she hadn't felt in years. It had been so long since anyone had cared enough to notice those little things. Gradually, their calls became a comforting habit, a soothing melody Emily would look forward to each day. One afternoon, George invited her to join him for a visit to a flower garden outside the city. "The chrysanthemums have bloomed beautifully," he said. "Would you like to come with me this weekend?" Emily hesitated. Since her husband's death, she hadn't let anyone close enough to share such personal experiences and never ventured too far with anyone. But there was something in George's voice, sincere, kind, and inviting, that made her heart give way to the idea. She took a deep breath and replied softly, "Yes, I'll go with you. If you don't mind, of course." That weekend, they made the journey to the outskirts of the city. The road stretched on for a while, but the view was so beautiful, it felt almost like another world. The garden was a sea of bright yellow chrysanthemums, stretching out to the horizon. It was as though Emily had stepped into a peaceful, fresh world, one filled with color and calm. As they walked along the flower beds, George shared stories of his travels when he was younger, his voice blending with the soft breeze. His gentle laughter filled the air, and Emily found herself smiling without thinking, something she hadn't done in a long time. At that moment, she realized how long it had been since she'd allowed herself to relax and laugh so freely. She had forgotten what it felt like to be truly at ease with someone. As the weeks passed, Emily's life began to shift. The quiet days she had spent alone, filled with routine and solitude, were now filled with phone calls and meetings that brought unexpected joy. George had become like a new breeze in her life, refreshing and gentle, shaking up the stillness of her years with new energy. Then, one afternoon, near the end of the year, George surprised her with a proposal. "Emily, I know we're not getting any younger," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "We've both seen so much in our lives, joys, sorrows, and everything in between. But at our age, I think we deserve someone to share our lives with, someone to lean on. What do you think?" Emily looked into his eyes, caught off guard by the question. "George, what are you saying?" Her voice trembled slightly as she processed the weight of his words. His voice softened. "I want you, Emily, to be my life partner." For a moment, Emily felt like she was dreaming. After so many years of living alone, she had never really considered remarriage. The idea of sharing her life with someone else felt unfamiliar, even daunting. But there was something about George, his patience, his kindness, that made her heart soften in a way she hadn't expected. Over the next few days, Emily thought deeply about his proposal. She wondered if it was the right decision, if her children would support it, and whether she was ready for such a big change. But George's warm phone calls, filled with reassurance and tenderness, slowly eased her fears. Finally, on a quiet afternoon, Emily picked up the phone and called George. "I agree," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of relief and excitement. On the other end, George paused for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was full of joy. "Thank you, Emily. Thank you. I promise to bring you happiness." If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Their wedding was simple, cozy, and intimate, with only close friends and family invited. Emily wore a light blue dress that she loved, her face radiant but still showing signs of the uncertainty she felt. George stood beside her, his eyes full of love, as though she were the most precious thing life had given him. Emily's children were also present, though their expressions held unspoken thoughts and concerns. Her eldest son gently pulled her aside during the reception. "Mom, are you sure about this? You don't need to do this at your age. It's okay to live alone." Emily looked at her son with soft, understanding eyes. "I've thought this through carefully, my child. I'm not young anymore to bear the weight of everything. I just want a companion, someone to share the rest of my life with." Her son nodded, his concern still visible, but he respected her decision. Though he was worried, he couldn't deny the happiness he saw in his mother's eyes. That evening, as the party came to a close, Emily sat beside George in the home he had prepared for them to live together. The living room was simple yet warmly decorated. Each piece of furniture and decoration seemed to carry the marks of a family that had lived there for many years. George gently took Emily's hand and said, "From now on, you won't have to be lonely. We will share our lives, peacefully and happily." Emily looked at him, her heart stirring with a mix of emotions. She believed that this was the right decision. After so many years of living in solitude, quietly and alone, she now had someone with whom to share both her joys and her sorrows. Each day, through the window, the soft glow of the moon shone down on their small yard, marking the start of a new beginning in Emily's life. A fresh start, as gentle and new as the first day she moved in with George. The new environment was both exciting and unfamiliar to Emily. George's house was spacious and well-equipped, but everything was arranged with a level of precision and order that felt a bit rigid to her. As she walked into the living room, Emily noticed that every pillow on the sofa was arranged just so, as if by a maid's hand. The decorations were pristine, reflecting the light of the room, and George's house was so spotless that it seemed like no one had ever lived there. "Wow, how do you keep the house so neat?" Emily asked as George showed her around. George chuckled, his voice still deep and warm but now tinged with a hint of pride. "I've always been a bit of a neat freak. Ever since I was young, everything has to be tidy for me to feel at peace." Emily nodded, but inside, she felt a bit of discomfort. She was used to her own home, where there were small corners filled with flowers and books scattered across tables, and old wooden chairs that creaked softly when someone sat down. This perfect orderliness made her feel more like a guest than someone who truly belonged in this space. Still, the first days of living together were sweet. George took great care of Emily, just as he had promised on their wedding day. Every morning, he would prepare a cup of tea and call her to wake up. "The tea's ready, Emily. Time to get up and have some. I've heard chrysanthemum tea is good for your health." Emily smiled every time she saw George holding the teapot, so thoughtful and attentive despite his age. His consideration brought a warmth to her that she had missed for so long. She laughed along with him, but inside, she felt somewhat surprised. She had always loved her freedom and spontaneity, while George was someone who thrived on structure and routine. Then, after the initial sweetness of their new life, small differences began to emerge. Emily wasn't very focused on the small details around the house, but George was. One day, she left a handkerchief on the kitchen table and forgot to put it away. When George saw it, he frowned slightly and said, in a somewhat stern voice, "The handkerchief shouldn't be left on the kitchen table. Please remember to put things back where they belong." Emily was momentarily taken aback by the reprimand but responded gently, "Okay, I'll remember." She thought it was just George's habit, so she tried to adapt, but over time, these small issues began to crop up more frequently. George had his own set of principles that he expected Emily to follow, everything from how things were arranged in the house to how meals were prepared and the timing of their daily routines. One morning, Emily accidentally overslept until 8 a.m. When George entered the room, he stood by the door, looking at her with a gentle but implied disapproval. "Emily," he said, his voice light but with a note of seriousness, "waking up late isn't good for your health. We're getting older now, and we should maintain the habit of waking up early." Emily opened her eyes and stared at him for a long moment. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she thought to herself, "How long has it been since I had a good night's sleep?" She reflected on how, in her previous life, she had been free to do things as she pleased, with no one reminding her or dictating her actions. But now, it seemed as if she was learning to live within someone else's framework, someone else's structure. The differences between them grew more evident as George's family became more involved in their lives. George's children visited regularly on the weekends, and at first, Emily greeted them warmly. But she quickly noticed that they always looked at her with a distant, scrutinizing gaze. During one meal, George's daughter suddenly said, "It's been a long time since Dad's wife passed away, and you've been living alone all this time. It must have been difficult for you. Now, having Emily here is good, but Dad, don't forget to take care of your assets carefully." Her words hit Emily like an invisible arrow, making her hands tremble slightly as she picked up her food. She tried to maintain her composure, but the discomfort lingered. George looked at his daughter with a frown and said firmly, "What are you saying? Don't speak like that." His daughter shrugged and said no more, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't fully accepted into George's family. Those words from George's daughter pierced Emily's heart like invisible daggers. She remained silent, trying to maintain her calm composure, but her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her chopsticks. George looked at his daughter, his face tightening with concern. "What are you saying?" "Don't speak like that," he said, his voice firm yet filled with disapproval. His daughter shrugged dismissively and said no more. But from that moment on, Emily understood that she was not fully accepted into George's family, no matter how hard she tried. After that night, Emily often lay awake, unable to sleep. She thought about her old home, the one she had left behind. The small house was quiet and peaceful, where she could do everything as she liked, and it had always felt like hers. Now, sitting in George's spacious house, she felt like a stranger, lost and alone. One evening, she found herself sitting in the garden, staring out at the open space, her mind wandering. George approached quietly, noticing her silence. "Why are you sitting out here all alone? Is something bothering you?" he asked softly. Emily shook her head gently, her voice as soft as the evening breeze. "No, I'm just thinking about the old garden." George frowned slightly but didn't press her for more details. "You've had a good life, Emily. Why are you still sad?" he asked, genuinely perplexed by her melancholy. As the days went on, Emily began to realize that the happiness she had once thought she'd find in this new chapter of her life was slipping away. Life with George, while neat and orderly, wasn't the peaceful refuge she had hoped for. It was filled with rules, pressure, and constraints. Their personalities and habits were so different, and the cold distance between her and George's family began to feel like small, quiet needles, pricking at her heart every day. One evening, as Emily sat alone in the living room, she opened a drawer and took out an old photograph. It was a picture of her small, familiar home, the one she had lived in for so many years. A tear slipped down her cheek as she stared at it. She wondered if she had been wrong all along. Had she been too focused on finding happiness through someone else when the true happiness had always been within her? Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, a sound that felt like a sigh, a hidden emotion trying to escape. After that night, as Emily wiped away her tears, something inside her began to shift. The suffocation of this new life, this new chapter, felt heavier than she had anticipated. Remarrying had promised her a companion in her later years, but the reality was not as she had imagined it. It wasn't the comfort and peace she had envisioned. It was a life filled with expectations, adjustments, and a sense of losing herself in the process. The next morning, Emily woke later than usual. The sunlight had already streamed into the room, filling the space with a soft glow. As she opened the door and stepped out into the kitchen, she found George sitting at the table, reading the newspaper. When he saw her, his face grew stern. "You're sleeping late again, Emily. I've told you before that we're getting older, we should be waking up early. It's not good for your health." His tone wasn't loud, but it was full of reproach. Emily sighed softly but didn't respond. Inside, she felt a discomfort, a heaviness that seemed to fill her chest. She felt as though she were a guest in her own life, constantly having to follow rules and regulations that she never chose. During breakfast, she sat in silence, holding her tea without drinking it, her eyes gazing out the window, lost in thought. Finally, George put the newspaper down, noticing her quiet change. He looked at her, his gaze softening a bit. "What's wrong, Emily?" Emily shook her head slightly. "Nothing. I'm just thinking about my old home," she said, her voice barely a whisper. George paused, furrowing his brow, but then responded with a hint of dissatisfaction in his voice. "Your old house was small, cramped, and didn't have much. But here, you have everything you need. Why do you still long for it?" Those words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She didn't answer him. She simply stood up, took her cup of tea, and walked into the kitchen. Her heart felt heavy, weighed down by a longing that George couldn't understand. The freedom of her old home, the warmth of the small spaces she had cherished, the simple comforts she had never realized she missed until now. All the conveniences of George's house, though abundant, couldn't replace the sense of peace she once had. In the following days, the small conflicts between Emily and George became more frequent. Though they rarely spoke of them openly, the little differences accumulated, creating cracks in their relationship that became more and more difficult to ignore. One day, as Emily was trimming flowers in the garden, George came out to join her. He looked at the flowers she had cut and frowned. "Emily, you're cutting the flowers all wrong. These need to be longer to look beautiful. I've told you this before." If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Emily stood there, her scissors in hand, and looked at George with a mixture of surprise and sadness. She didn't respond right away but simply said, "I like cutting them the way I want. You might think it's not beautiful, but to me, it feels right." George was silent for a moment, his gaze softening, but he didn't say anything more. He turned and walked back into the house. The silences between them grew more frequent, as did the small frustrations. That weekend, George's children came over, and as usual, Emily greeted them warmly, but she could feel the judgment in their eyes. The family dinner that night unfolded in a tense, almost suffocating atmosphere. To Emily's surprise, it was George's daughter who initiated the conversation. "Mom, I heard that we're about to transfer some assets within the family. Have you done the math on it?" George's daughter said suddenly during dinner. "Now that Dad has a new wife, we need to be careful about whether we let outsiders influence things." Her words hit Emily like a sharp needle, piercing through her calm facade. She could feel her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her food, but she did her best to remain composed. George snapped, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you saying? You can't talk like that about me or my wife." His daughter only shrugged, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at Emily. "I was just saying, Mom. Don't take it personally. I just want to make sure Dad is taken care of and isn't being taken advantage of." That night, Emily couldn't eat. The words hung in the air like an unbearable weight. She felt like an outsider in George's life, though she never intended to be. As she sat quietly in the living room later that evening, she finally spoke up, her voice calm but filled with sorrow. "George, I feel like I don't belong here. Maybe I was wrong to think I could fit into your family." George looked at her in surprise, his brows furrowing. "What are you saying? Is something wrong with my family?" he asked, genuinely confused by her words. Emily gently shook her head, her voice catching in her throat. "It's not about whether things are good or not. I just feel like I don't belong. Your life has so many rules, and I've spent so many years enjoying my freedom. I don't feel like myself anymore." George's face softened with fleeting sadness. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. The distance between them seemed to widen, even though they were sitting so close. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her old life, the simple days when she could brew tea, read books late into the night, or tend to the flowers in her garden without anyone telling her how things should be. Those small pleasures had now become a distant memory, a luxury she could no longer afford. The life she had imagined in her marriage was not turning out the way she had hoped. Remarrying had been meant to bring companionship in her later years, but now she realized those dreams were built on an illusion. As she sat on the balcony that night, the wind gently rustling the leaves of the trees, Emily whispered to herself, "Maybe it's time for me to decide." The next morning, Emily woke later than usual. The sunlight streamed in through the windows, filling the large room with light. When she stepped into the kitchen, George was sitting at the table, reading the newspaper. He looked up when he saw her, and his expression hardened. "You're sleeping in again, Emily. We've talked about this. We're older now. We need to wake up early. It's better for your health." Emily sighed softly but didn't respond. She felt a heaviness in her chest, as though she were just a guest in someone else's life, having to follow all of these rules. She sat at the table, holding her tea without drinking it, her gaze distant. After a while, George noticed her silence and set the newspaper down. He leaned in, his voice soft but insistent. "What's going on, Emily?" Emily shook her head slightly. "Nothing. I'm just thinking about my old home," she said quietly. George paused for a moment, his brow furrowing with concern. But then his voice grew sharper, almost defensive. Your old house was small and had nothing compared to this. Here, you have everything you need. Why would you still long for it? Emily didn't answer right away. Her heart felt heavy as she realized that George couldn't understand the comfort and peace she had once found in her small home. The warmth, the freedom. She stood up, took her cup of tea, and walked to the kitchen, her heart weighed down by emotions George would never grasp. Over the following days, the small conflicts between them began to build. They rarely spoke openly about the issues, but they were always there, simmering beneath the surface. One afternoon, Emily was trimming the flowers in the garden when George walked up behind her. He glanced at the flowers she had cut and frowned. "Emily, you're cutting the flowers wrong. They need to be longer to look right. How many times have I told you this?" Emily stood there, scissors in hand, her eyes showing brief flashes of sadness. She looked at George and softly said, "I like cutting them the way I want. Maybe it's not perfect, but to me, it feels natural." George was silent for a moment as if he were about to say something, but instead, he turned and walked back inside without a word. The silence between them grew more frequent. That weekend, George's children came over for a visit. Emily greeted them politely, but she could feel the scrutiny in their eyes. The family dinner that night was filled with an odd tension. To Emily's surprise, it was George's daughter who broke the silence. However, Emily's peaceful days didn't last long. A week later, George came to visit. He stood at the door holding a large black umbrella, his face looking more haggard and tired than it had the day she left. Emily was startled when she opened the door to find him standing there, but quickly regained her composure. "George, what are you doing here?" she asked softly. George looked at her, his eyes filled with deep sorrow. He stepped inside when Emily invited him and took a seat on the old wooden chair in her modest living room, feeling disoriented. It was so different from his large, luxurious home. George looked around the room for a moment before speaking. "It's been a week since you left. Why haven't you called me once?" Emily sat down opposite him, her hands resting gently on the tea table. She looked at him for a long moment before responding. "I think we both need time to rethink things." George sighed deeply. "I know I've made mistakes. I've been too rigid, trying to control everything. I thought that by managing everything for you, by keeping things structured, you'd feel safe and happy. But I see now that it made you feel trapped, like you lost yourself." Emily listened quietly, understanding that George's nature couldn't be changed. She softly replied, "George, you're not wrong. You're a good man, and you've been a responsible partner. But we're just not right for each other. I can't live in such a structured way. I'm used to a life of freedom, one where I make my own choices." George bowed his head, his hands clenched tightly, as though the weight of her words was sinking in. After a long pause, he spoke in a quieter voice. "So, you want to end this?" Emily looked at him with gentle but determined eyes. "At my age, I don't have the luxury of time to live for anyone else. I need to live for myself. I need to live a life where I can feel comfortable and at peace." The room fell silent. The wind outside whispered through the window, carrying the faint scent of the chrysanthemums Emily had grown in her garden. George sat there for a long while, his gaze lingering on Emily with watery eyes, though he fought back tears. Slowly, he stood up. "If that's what you want, I will respect your decision," he said softly. Emily nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She watched as George walked out of her home, his figure slowly disappearing down the small path that led to the street. A sense of sadness lingered in her heart, but she knew deep down this was something she had to do for herself. On the day of the divorce hearing, Emily and George met again. They sat across from each other in the courtroom, each maintaining a calm exterior, though both were undoubtedly feeling the weight of the separation deep inside. When the court officially declared the end of their marriage, Emily felt a surprising sense of relief, though a heavy, indescribable sadness remained. As they left the courthouse, George approached Emily and extended his hand to gently take hers. "Thank you for being by my side for a while. I truly wish you happiness," he said with sincerity. Emily looked at him and smiled softly. "Thank you, George. I wish the same for you." They shook hands, a final gesture of respect and closure. Each of them turned and walked in different directions. Emily didn't look back as she walked away, but she felt a quiet sense of tranquility settle within her. This marriage had ended, but Emily didn't regret it. She had learned an important lesson. Happiness doesn't necessarily come from having someone by your side. Sometimes, the greatest peace comes from within oneself. Back home, Emily stood in her small yard, taking a deep breath. The yellow chrysanthemums swayed gently in the breeze, almost as if welcoming her return. She brewed a cup of tea, set it down on the wooden table on the porch, and sat down to gaze at the clear, blue sky. She whispered to herself, "From now on, my life will be mine. I will live meaningful, free, and peaceful days." If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment below to let me know that you are still here with me. The days passed, and Emily's peaceful life continued. One day, she ran into her old friend, Charlotte, a close companion from her school days. Charlotte stepped into Emily's small home, and her eyes lit up when she saw the blooming, colorful garden. "Emily, it's been so long. Your garden is still as beautiful as ever." "I heard you and George have separated," Charlotte said, her voice filled with gentle curiosity. Emily smiled softly, pouring a cup of hot tea for her old friend. "Yes, we parted ways. But I truly believe it was the right decision, especially at our age. We don't need anything extravagant. A free and peaceful life, without anyone imposing their expectations, is enough." Charlotte studied Emily for a moment before sighing softly. "You're right," she said. "Sometimes, living alone can bring more happiness than staying with someone who doesn't truly understand you. It looks like you're doing well, at peace." Emily returned her friend's smile, light and relieved, and responded, "I used to think I needed someone to support me in my later years. But now, I realize that happiness doesn't have to come from someone else. Sometimes, the most important thing is to love yourself and live the life you want." Charlotte nodded in agreement, and the two women turned their gaze to the garden, where the yellow chrysanthemums bloomed brightly in the midday sun, a quiet reminder of the simplicity and beauty in Emily's life. In the weeks that followed, Emily's life grew richer and more meaningful. She joined various clubs for seniors in her neighborhood, where she and her peers practiced health exercises every morning, walked around the park together, and engaged in cheerful conversations, laughing like young girls again. During one of these gatherings, Emily shared her story with the group. "I used to think that getting divorced at our age would bring happiness, but that's not always the case. I've learned that in our later years, we need freedom and independence, not just in our routines, but in our spirits. Living alone doesn't mean being lonely. Sometimes, it's even more fulfilling than living with someone who doesn't understand you." The group clapped, and the conversation shifted to the various philosophies of life that each member held. Some preferred to live near their children, while others chose the path of solitude, enjoying the freedom that came with living independently. Regardless of their personal choices, everyone agreed that the most important thing was to live happily and comfortably on their terms. So, what have we learned from Emily's journey? Happiness doesn't come from external circumstances, but from within. Whether it's learning to live freely, making decisions that align with your true self, or finding peace in solitude, sometimes the most meaningful steps toward fulfillment are the ones we take on our own. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one thing you've learned from Emily's story that you plan to bring into your own life? Please share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories and insights. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.